you may spot a strange, blocky silhouette guarding the entrance to the vast natural harbour. On closer inspection, you'd probably realise that this ship is in fact entirely stationary, and its hull made from thick concrete.
Imagine a massive fortress that defied the most powerful weapons of World War II, standing solid as a rock for decades. Yet inside, dozens of soldiers lay trapped and forgotten. What forces could create such an impenetrable structure? And what desperate measures were taken to finally breach its walls?
Its strong defensive position would also later see it become a holdout for Japanese forces when the Philippines were retaken in 1945. Fort Drum's final dramatic last stand would see it stormed and concluded in a grisly, explosive end.
More than 70 years after it was sealed shut, this concrete battleship sits quietly in Manila Bay, a haunting time capsule of fire, engineering, and war. The story of how 68 Japanese soldiers met their grim fate inside offers a chilling glimpse into the brutal innovation and tragedy of combat. The impregnable concrete fortress. Fort Drum stood as a monument to military engineering. A fortress so tough it seemed untouchable by conventional arms. Built like a battleship, this concrete giant rose from the waters of Manila Bay. Its walls, a staggering 20 feet thick, reinforced with steel mesh every 6 inches. For 36 hours, American forces unloaded everything they had at the fortress: artillery barrages, naval gunfire, and hundreds of 2,000-pound bombs. But the concrete shell didn't budge. Inside, 68 Japanese soldiers were ready, stocked with months' worth of food, fresh water, and ammunition that could last a year. Conventional siege tactics failed, and the fortress remained a silent, immovable threat blocking the harbor. The fortress's reputation as the strongest in the world was well earned. Its massive 14-inch gun turrets could strike targets over 15 miles away, and the walls could absorb direct hits from battleship cannons without structural damage. Every approach was covered by machine gun nests, and the Japanese defenders had no shortage of firepower or supplies. The Americans faced a dilemma: how to breach a fortress literally carved from reinforced concrete to be impervious to any bombardment or direct assault. Time was running short, and the usual methods of warfare were proving futile. The challenge wasn't just about breaking through walls. It was about overcoming a well-fortified and prepared enemy concealed within an almost indestructible shell. The concrete walls weren't just protection, they were a trap. With only 2 exits, the main entrance at water level and ventilation hatches on the roof, any escape was nearly impossible. This fortress could hold out indefinitely, a floating tomb for those inside, and a seemingly endless obstacle blocking Allied access to Manila Harbor. The Americans had tried everything, but the fortress refused to fall. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson studied Fort Drum from his ship, searching for weakness in the fortress's armor. He knew that a direct attack could cost many lives without success. The longer the siege went on, the more danger it posed to the larger campaign to retake the Philippines and ultimately end the war. But what chance did they have against a structure nearly impregnable to shellfire, bombs, and infantry attack? Patterson's plan would turn everything on its head, finding a path not through brute force, but through a dangerous and daring strategy. The Americans could bombard Fort Drum continuously for a year and barely scratch its surface. Yet, the fortress was more than a structure. It was a symbol of defiance, holding a small number of soldiers who believed their concrete tomb was indestructible. The idea of simply opening its front door was considered absurd, even insane, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Behind the fortress's steadfast walls lay a secret that only the boldest plan could unveil. This fortress's endurance had frustrated commanders and soldiers alike. It was clear that breaking in wasn't about weapons. but about ingenuity. The fortress's very strength made it vulnerable in ways the Japanese hadn't realized. The big question was how to exploit that vulnerability without falling prey to the fortress's deadly defenses. The story of how this was done is as remarkable as the fortress itself. Yet the fortress was more than just a military target. It was a symbol. To the Japanese, it was a last bastion of defense and pride. To the Americans, it was a seemingly impossible problem demanding a solution beyond traditional warfare. Many lives hung in the balance, and the outcome would depend not on firepower alone, but on daring creativity and technical skill. The stakes were higher than just a battle. They involved the fate of an entire campaign. The fortress, which could have been a grave for any attacking force, would soon become a fiery tomb for those inside. The question was how to turn a symbol of invincibility into something else entirely. The layers of concrete and steel that protected the defenders would soon be the very walls that sealed their fate. Yet, before that dramatic turn, it was necessary to understand what had made Fort Drum so formidable. The story of Fort Drum's origins reveals how an unremarkable rocky island transformed into this steel-reinforced giant. Origins of Fort Drum. Fort Drum was not always a fortress. It began life as El Fraile Island, a rocky outcrop rising 40 feet above Manila Bay's waters, just 500 feet long and 200 feet wide. Its location was perfect for controlling access to Manila Harbor, but the island itself was little more than a natural obstacle. In 1909, the U.S. Army saw potential, but not in the rock. It was the location they coveted. Their vision was far more ambitious: to completely replace the island with a weapon of war. Constructing Fort Drum was a colossal task that took nearly a decade. The first step was to blast away the natural granite until a level foundation remained. Wooden forms were then built to shape the massive reinforced concrete structure, which was poured layer by layer until the walls stood 20 feet thick on all sides, rising 40 feet above the waterline. It wasn't just a fortress, it was an artificial island, a battleship carved from concrete and steel that could never sink or be moved. By 1918, El Fraile Island had vanished beneath this new concrete shell. In its place was Fort Drum, a marvel of engineering described by the Americans themselves as the strongest fortress on Earth. Inside its walls were two massive 14-inch gun turrets, each weighing 300 tons, with the ability to fire shells over 15 miles away. Beneath that, ammunition storage held nearly 1,000 shells per gun, and living quarters were designed to support 200 soldiers for 6 months without resupply. The walls were reinforced not just with sheer thickness, but with steel mesh every 6 inches, making it essentially impervious to the shells of the time. Fort Drum was designed to withstand any naval bombardment and to serve as an immovable guardian of the entrance to the bay. It was a new kind of fort, a floating fortress without sails or propulsion, its flat deck a symbol of raw strength and technology. Despite being immovable, it was built to act offensively. The powerful guns could strike enemy ships before they ever approached the harbor, giving Manila Bay an invisible shield. The strategic value of the island was immense. No ship could enter without risk of being sunk. It was a fortress designed not just to defend, but to dominate. The sheer scale and ambition behind Fort Drum's construction captured the military's faith in coastal defense at the time. The early 20th century was an era when battleships and heavy artillery defined naval power, and fixed coastal defenses like Fort Drum were considered the ultimate deterrent. The advances in aviation and missile technology that would one day render such fortresses obsolete had not yet arrived. The story of Fort Drum's occupation by Japanese forces shows how this seemingly indestructible fortress became a critical piece of the Pacific War. Japanese occupation and strategic control. On May 6, 1942, Fort Drum fell into Japanese hands during their rapid advance in the Philippines. The same day saw the fall of Corregidor, the last American stronghold in Manila Bay, marking a critical turning point in the battle for control of the region. The Japanese recognized immediately the significance of this concrete battleship. It was an unsinkable fortress blocking one of the most strategically vital ports in the Pacific. They moved 68 men from the 17th Independent Mixed Regiment into the fortress, engineers, gunners, radio operators, just enough to operate the complex machinery and guns. The garrison was well prepared to hold the fortress indefinitely. They had stockpiled enough food to last 6 months, fresh water to last 3, and ammunition sufficient for a siege that could stretch for a year or even longer. For 3 long years, Fort Drum controlled Manila Bay. Its 14-inch guns could destroy cruisers with a single shot, making any Allied naval movement near the harbor virtually impossible. The concrete walls soaked up direct hits that would have shattered lesser forts, remaining solid and unyielding. The fortress became a deadly guardian, a constant threat to forces attempting to reclaim the Philippines. The Japanese had fortified every inch of the structure. Machine gun nests covered the roof, observation posts dotting every approach. Their defense strategy capitalized on Fort Drum's near impenetrable design, making it seem a hopeless task for any attacker. The combined firepower and massive concrete protection made the fortress a formidable linchpin in their control of Manila. But by April 1945, the war had shifted dramatically. Allied forces had gained control of the Philippines, and Manila Harbor was key to launching the next phase of the Pacific Campaign. Fort Drum was the last serious obstacle preventing American ships from entering the harbor and ensuring supplies and reinforcements for the invasion of Japan. It was a concrete wall between victory and prolonging the fight. The Japanese defenders had no intention of surrendering. Their supplies and preparations meant they could hold out indefinitely, making a traditional assault costly and seemingly futile. Their position seemed impregnable, and their control of the harbor was a daily threat to Allied efforts in the region. Yet, their fortress was also a sealed trap. The fortress's strengths were also its vulnerabilities, and this paradox would soon be exploited with consequences that no one could have predicted. The story of how the American forces planned to finally wrest Fort Drum from the Japanese reveals a daring and unorthodox approach to one of the Pacific War's toughest challenges. The next steps would bring innovation born of necessity and a plan that would turn the fortress's impenetrable walls into the very source of its defeat. The challenge facing American forces. By April 1945, the strategic landscape in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. American forces had retaken much of the Philippines, yet Fort Drum remained a stubborn obstacle blocking Manila Harbor, the gateway the Allies needed to supply their push toward Japan. This fortress was unlike any other. Its massive concrete walls and powerful guns controlled every approach, preventing Allied ships from safely entering the harbor. Standard siege tactics proved useless, and the usual array of weapons and soldiers simply could not overcome this concrete giant. The Japanese defenders had prepared extensively for a long siege. They stockpiled food, water, and ammunition sufficient to last well beyond the fighting into 1946 if necessary. Their position was virtually impregnable, with the concrete walls absorbing direct hits from battleship cannons and machine gun nests covering every angle of attack. Launching an amphibious assault was equally risky. Landing troops on the fortress's flat, heavily defended roof meant facing deadly machine gun fire and nearly guaranteed heavy casualties. American commanders knew that simply pounding the fortress with artillery would not force a surrender. The 20-foot thick walls had withstood days of bombardment without significant damage. Meanwhile, time worked against the Allies. Every hour, the fortress remained operational, allowed the Japanese to reinforce their defenses and make eventual attacks even more costly. Despite overwhelming firepower arrayed against it, Fort Drum held its sinister grip on Manila Bay. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson studied the fortress carefully. From his platform aboard the LSM-43, a landing craft specially converted for unique operations, he scanned the fort's defenses through binoculars. The top of Fort Drum was flat, like a ship's deck, 40 feet above the waterline, surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun positions. Conventional assaults had failed repeatedly, so Patterson began searching for an alternative, one that did not rely on brute force, but on outsmarting the fortress's design. Landing crafts approaching Fort Drum were cut down by precise Japanese fire. Every approach was a slail zone, and even armored vessels risked destruction. The fortress's guns, smaller but deadly 37mm anti-aircraft weapons, had enough range and accuracy to keep attackers at bay. The main 14-inch guns, though unable to depress low enough to target ships pressed against the walls, provided psychological weight and defensive firepower from their protected turrets. The fortress's incredible strength was also a kind of prison. With two possible exits, the main entrance at water level and ventilation shafts on the roof, any attempt to bypass the defenses was a gamble. Locked behind those thick walls, the defenders had almost no reason to sally forth, while attackers faced near-suicidal odds trying to storm the position. This stalemate forced American strategists to think creatively about how to win this battle without massive losses. Morale among the American troops was tense. The knowledge that past assaults had failed weighed heavily on their minds. Commanders understood that continuing conventional tactics would cost more lives and still achieve little. Despite having overwhelming naval and air superiority elsewhere, this fortress near Manila was a glaring weak point that needed resolving if the campaign was to succeed. The next phase demanded innovation and a readiness to risk everything, setting the stage for a high-stakes assault unlike any before it. Lieutenant Commander Patterson's bold plan. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson proposed an audacious plan that defied traditional military logic. Instead of continuing to batter the impenetrable walls, he intended to open the front door, literally, to the fortress and then lock it from the inside. His idea depended on turning Fort Drum itself into a sealed chamber that could be filled with a highly flammable mixture, effectively turning the fortress into a massive oven. This strategy relied on one fundamental fact: the fortress's strength was also its vulnerability. The thick concrete walls and steel-reinforced roof made it nearly impossible to breach. But they also trapped the defenders inside, with only a few ventilation shafts connecting interior air to the outside. If those shafts could be sealed after pumping in a flammable fuel vapor, the fortress would become a sealed environment, primed for ignition. To execute this, Patterson used the LSM-43, a tank landing craft specially armored and modified for unusual operations. The ship was capable of carrying over 200 tons of equipment directly onto enemy positions. Patterson planned to crash the ship into Fort Drum's wall at full speed, lower the ramp onto the flat roof, and deploy 40 Marines at once to secure the ventilation hatches. This was not an amphibious landing on a beach, but a direct assault onto a fortress's roof. The Marines had trained intensively for their specific mission, knowing exactly where the ventilation shafts were located and how much explosive material would be necessary to seal each one. The plan's success hinged on speed and surprise. If Japanese forces managed to disable the ship's bow ramp or destroy the pumping equipment, the entire mission would fail. The stakes were unimaginably high, and failure meant likely death for those involved. Once the Marines secured the roof, engineers would pump 3,000 gallons of a carefully crafted fuel mixture, consisting of diesel to sustain the fire, aviation gasoline for rapid ignition, and motor oil to create thick, choking smoke, directly into the fortress interior through the ventilation system. This vapor would fill every chamber, corridor, and sealed room, making the entire fortress a tinderbox waiting to ignite. Ignition required more than ordinary sparks. Patterson's team brought 200 pounds of thermite, a compound burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, capable of melting steel and igniting fuel vapor even in oxygen-depleted environments. White phosphorus grenades would supplement the thermite, burning fiercely and producing toxic smoke to ensure that anyone surviving the initial blast would suffocate quickly. The daring plan to turn Fort Drum against its defenders would soon reach its climax. Execution of the assault. At dawn on April 13, 1945, LSM-43 roared toward Fort Drum at full speed, cloaked in heavy armor and carrying its daring cargo, 40 Marines and 3,000 gallons of a special fuel mixture. The ship was unlike any landing craft used before, converted for this unique mission to ram the fortress and secure its roof. Japanese machine gunners opened fire from fortified positions on the fortress's deck, peppering the armored ship with bullets and 37mm shells. Despite the hail of fire, the vessel pushed onward, a determined battering ram targeting the concrete battleship. At about 50 yards from the wall, the landing craft's bow slammed into Fort Drum at 12 knots, the impact throwing the Marines onto their knees as the armored ramp crashed down onto the fortress roof. Lieutenant Commander Patterson was the first ashore, submachine gun blazing, followed closely by his Marines who poured onto the flat roof in a shock assault. The defenders were caught off guard. Expecting attacks from sea level or surrounding beaches, they hadn't anticipated an amphibious landing directly on their roof from a ramp lowered by a ship that had just smashed through their front door. The ensuing firefight lasted 12 brutal minutes. The Japanese fought fiercely from prepared positions behind sandbags and concrete barriers, but they were deeply outnumbered and surprised. The Marines quickly moved to secure key points, focusing on the ventilation hatches, knowing that control of the air system was critical to the success of the plan. Sergeant Mike Kowalski led the charge on the main ventilation shaft, dropping grenades to clear defenders before advancing through the smoke toward the hatch. The ventilation shaft dropped 30 feet down into the depths of the fortress, lined with steel plates designed to protect the internal air system. At the bottom, Japanese soldiers prepared for siege, unaware that their air supply would soon become a lethal trap. While the Marines held the roof and sealed the fortress's lungs, engineers began unloading their crucial equipment. Industrial pumps, hoses, and tanks filled with the diesel, aviation gasoline, and motor oil mixture specially formulated for this mission. One by one, hoses were lowered down the ventilation shafts as the pumps began their relentless work. 3,000 gallons of the volatile fuel mixture flowed steadily into the fortress, saturating air ducts, corridors, and living quarters. The mixture was designed for high ignition quality. Diesel for sustained flames, gasoline for rapid ignition, and motor oil to produce thick, choking smoke that would fill every corner of the fortress's interior. Any breath taken inside now dragged flammable vapor deep into the lungs of the defenders. The chemical fumes, heavy and sweet, spread throughout Fort Drum, prompting the Japanese to recognize the imminent danger just in time. Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki, aware of the tragic fate of the fort, commanded without delay the shutting down of the ventilation fans and the fortification of the main entrances with the fortress doors. The defenders occupied the lowest and most secure rooms, which they thought their concrete tomb would protect them with from the upcoming attack. But the very construction of the fortress had now turned against them and was isolating them with the vapor saturated with fuel that needed just one more spark to become lethal. At 7:30 a.m., Patterson, together with his demolition crew, commenced the setting of the ignition charges. The main shaft of ventilation was thermite igniters lowered into it, and white phosphorus grenades were very carefully passed around among secondary air vents. The fuses were set up for detonation at the same time. The moment was full of suspense as the Japanese soldiers above heard the sounds of American footsteps and commands and, thus, got ready for an attack that they could neither see nor fight in a conventional way. At last, at 7:47 a.m., all the American personnel got off the roof, and the landing craft retreated to a secure distance. The ship's crew and Marines took cover behind armored plating, expecting the inevitable. Then, the charges went off. A massive fireball of blazing orange flames shot out of every opening, the main ventilation shaft turning into a rocket nozzle that was ejecting fire 200 feet into the air. The very sound of the explosion shook the walls of the fortress like never before. What had once been an impregnable fortress was now an inferno, an unthinkable enemy turned against itself by the combination of human ingenuity and desperation. The firestorm inside Fort Drum. The flames poured from every vent and breach, consuming oxygen and turning the fortress into a sealed crematory. Inside, steel bulkheads melted and re-solidified in twisted, molten shapes. Concrete walls, designed to deflect shells, cracked under the extreme heat. The air shimmered with residual heat long after the initial explosion, revealing an environment utterly transformed by fire. In the aftermath, American engineers approached Fort Drum cautiously, waiting for the temperature to drop enough to enter safely. It took 6 days before the concrete walls cooled sufficiently to touch. When Patterson led the first team inside, he found the fortress's once fearsome steel door peeled back like tin foil, a testament to the immense force of the blast. Beyond it lay darkness and silence, the eerie calm after the firestorm. The bodies of the Japanese defenders were discovered throughout the interior. Some who attempted escape during the initial explosion died within mere steps, their lungs seared by the superheated air. Their remains were preserved by the intense heat, frozen in time as though caught in silent witness. Deeper in the fortress, the destruction was even more catastrophic. Gun equipment had melted and fused into solid blocks of metal. Ammunition had detonated, leaving behind welded brass casings embedded in scorched racks. The very heart of the fortress was unrecognizable, a distorted tomb forged from concrete and fire. But it was in the deepest chamber that Patterson found the most somber sight: the body of Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki and 44 defenders arranged in formation. They had sought refuge in what they thought was the safest place, shielded from the initial blast by 12 feet of reinforced concrete. Instead, the walls trapped them with superheated air and toxic smoke that slowly cooked them alive. The men were positioned as if awaiting orders, standing silently in a final act of discipline. None had escaped. None had surrendered. Patterson counted 68 bodies in total. Every Japanese soldier inside had died during the explosion or the subsequent fire. The fortress that had once seemed indestructible had become their oven, their tomb. The concrete walls that had been designed to protect them became the very instruments of their demise. A profound silence lingered inside the concrete shell, filled only by the memory of the battle that had burned its mark across history. Yet, beyond the devastation, Fort Drum endured. Although the walls showed signs of heat damage and the gun turrets were warped, the fortress itself remained structurally intact. It could have been repaired and returned to service, but the age of static coastal defenses had ended. New technologies rendered such fortifications obsolete, and Fort Drum was left to fade quietly into history. The story of this fiery siege is a stark reminder that sometimes ingenuity and determination become the most lethal weapons of war, turning even the strongest defenses into instruments of defeat. Aftermath and legacy. After the fire inside Fort Drum finally burned out and the fortress cooled enough to enter, American engineers faced a grim and surreal scene. The once impervious concrete shell showed heat damage, but no structural collapse, a testament to the fortress's legendary strength. The steel gun turrets were bent and warped from the inferno, yet still in place. Inside, however, every inch bore the scars of an intense and deadly conflagration. The operation left Fort Drum physically intact, but forever transformed. The remains of the 68 Japanese soldiers who had held the fortress were found throughout the interior. Many had died where they stood, their bodies preserved by the intense heat that effectively sterilized the entire interior. Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki and his men had gathered in what they thought was the safest chamber, only to be trapped and cooked by superheated air and toxic smoke. Their final formation stood silent, a haunting and solemn reminder of their unwavering discipline in the face of inevitable death. While the fortress survived, it was left too damaged and obsolete to be of military use. Advances in warfare had rendered fixed coastal fortifications like Fort Drum strategically irrelevant. Aircraft carriers, guided missiles, and rapid troop movements had changed the face of combat. Fort Drum's defeat marked not only the end of a fortress, but the end of an era dominated by static defenses. The government of the Philippines explored various options for Fort Drum after the war, which included converting it into a lighthouse, a radio station, or a tourist site. Still, the fortress remained closed, and its interior was mostly inaccessible due to either destruction or the honoring of the war dead. The engineers said that the burning at 1945 had actually preserved the concrete by eliminating both moisture and impurities, but nothing was done about the fate of those in the grave. Fort Drum is still a silent witness today at the place where El Fraile Island once existed. It is a concrete monument that has stopped at a certain time. The entrance holes have been sealed with welding, and the air holes have been closed with concrete. The fortress still controls the gateway to Manila Bay, being a ghostly reminder of the war's cruel and relentless character. Its armored gun turrets face the sea and are the everlasting protectors of a port that is already at peace and does not need them. The illustrious past of the 38 warriors who perished fighting for Fort Drum and who were never given a proper burial inside the structure has never been wiped out from the collective memory. The families of the fallen heroes were never capable of collecting their loved ones' remains. However, their valor is recognized in war memorials in Japan and is not forgotten by historians who deal with this period of history. The castle stands as a gloomy reminder of the price of war and the limits of engineering creativity when applied to military operations. The attack on Fort Drum is a subject of debate among historians as to whether it was necessary or not. There are some scholars who assert that the fortress had already been overlooked and hence posed no direct threat to the invasion of Japan. Conversely, others view the assault as a proof of American resourcefulness and the readiness to adopt the most daring tactics when all the others had failed. No matter the viewpoint, the operation still provides a stunning example of the ability to find creative solutions to impossible problems under extreme pressure. Fort Drum's story is a powerful reminder that even the strongest fortresses can fall when bold ideas meet relentless determination. It shows how ingenuity reshaped warfare and sealed the fate of 68 defenders lost within those concrete walls. If you found this tale fascinating, please like and subscribe for more stories of history's forgotten corners and daring feats.